Hey guys, tonight we drift quietly over the shimmering canals of Xochimilco, feeling the gentle sway beneath you, as if the water itself is rocking you into a story that's been asleep for centuries. You probably won't survive this without learning something strange. The Aztecs literally grew islands of food, floating gardens called chinampas, in lakes that seemed impossible to farm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know who's drifting through history alongside you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the narrow walkways separating the waterlogged plots, noticing how green everything is. Maize stalks rising tall like patient sentinels, squashes sprawling like lazy cats, and strange little berries you don't recognize at first glance. The air smells damp but vibrant, carrying a whisper of herbs that might have been part of breakfast, lunch, and dinner for people who built an empire on ingenuity. Historians still argue whether chinampas were primarily practical agricultural solutions, or if they also held spiritual significance, part of a worldview where every blade of grass had a role in the cosmic order. You can almost hear a 500-year-old debate echoing softly under the reeds. Was this efficiency or devotion? You pause to watch a farmer's long wooden pole nudging the canoes, balancing like a tightrope walker between water and earth. It's mesmerizing. Fringe tales suggest that some chinampas were even used for ceremonies under the moon, where fruits and flowers floated in intricate patterns to please the gods, or perhaps to impress visiting dignitaries. You can't help but imagine tiny offerings bobbing along the canals, golden and red in the twilight, almost like edible lanterns. A light breeze carries the scent of moist earth and young maize, and you feel oddly sleepy, as if the gardens themselves are lulling you into history. You remember reading somewhere that the Aztecs believed food grown on water was purer, somehow touched by life-giving forces that the soil alone could not provide. And yes, there's a cheeky mental image. You, trying to recreate this at home, floating your tomatoes in the bathtub. Not recommended. Bees hum lazily around flowering plants, oblivious to centuries of human ambition, and you notice how every plant seems intentional. Corn in one plot, beans twining up its stalks, squashes sprawled across the edges. The coordination feels like choreography, a silent ballet performed over water. You can almost sense the soft chatter of past gardeners, debating which crop to plant where, a conversation that historians still argue was equal parts science, observation, and maybe a pinch of superstition. Even the water itself seems alive. Tiny ripples reflect the late afternoon sun like scattered mirrors, and you imagine Aztec children paddling along these canals, the scent of fresh maize and sweet herbs trailing after them, while elders whisper stories of gods and rivers, and the stubborn resilience of floating earth. Fringe accounts claim some canals were lined with flowers that had magical properties, tiny, hidden charms meant to ensure good harvests, though scholars remain skeptical. As you settle into the gentle sway, letting the soft hum of the water seep into your bones, it's clear that Chinampas weren't just gardens. They were a statement, a floating manifesto of human ingenuity. And, as the sun tilts lower, casting long shadows across the shimmering surfaces, you realize you're no longer just an observer. You're drifting with history itself, carried along by water, soil, and the forgotten rhythm of Aztec life. You trudge past the chinampas, brushing your fingers along maize stalks that sway lazily, golden tassels shaking in the breeze. Maize, corn, wasn't just food. It was the backbone of the Aztec Empire, practically sacred. Every meal, every offering revolved around it. You probably didn't realize you're walking through a living supermarket from the 15th century, where maize, beans, and squash performed a symphony of sustenance. Historians still argue whether maize varieties were selected purely for nutrition, or if subtle ceremonial preferences guided the cultivation. Beyond the maize, cacao pods hang like miniature, ribbed lanterns on trees you might have mistaken for alien sculptures. The Aztecs prized cacao so much that it doubled as currency. Yes, tiny beans for trade, a secret snack for rulers, and possibly even a sleepy-time potion. Fringe tales claim nobles would grind cacao with flowers and spices to concoct a kind of Aztec hot chocolate that made dreams sweeter, though scholarly evidence is thin. You almost picture yourself sneaking a sip, grimacing at the bitter, spiced concoction, and realizing you probably wouldn't survive a noble's daily dose without wincing. You stumble upon a cluster of strange fruits, nopals with tiny red berries, guava relatives with soft fuzz, and oddly shaped squashes that look like they were designed by someone with a sense of humor. The Aztecs cultivated these alongside staples, yet many of these flavors vanished from memory once the Europeans arrived. Some fruits were said to be used medicinally. Fringe sources whisper that certain berries could cure everything from headaches to minor heartbreaks. But historians still debate which claims are rooted in reality and which were overblown folk stories. Walking along a narrow path between the floating gardens, you notice the subtle interplay of sweet and bitter aromas. Maize mixes with earthy squash scent. Cacao adds a distant chocolatey undertone, and a faint whiff of herbs drifts across the water. You almost want to taste everything at once, though you remember the stories about some experimental fruits being, shall we say, slightly more adventurous than your modern palate can handle. In a quiet aside, imagine the Aztec equivalent of a farmer shrugging and thinking, well, let's see if this grows, and if anyone survives the taste test. Bees and hummingbirds flit between flowers, doing what they've done for centuries, while you notice how each crop complements the other. Beans climbing corn stalks, squashes shading delicate roots. This method, known as the Three Sisters technique, is a marvel of ecological intuition. Fringe accounts suggest that some of these companion plants were thought to ward off spirits or even misbehaving neighbors' curses. Scholars, predictably, still debate whether this was ritual, superstition, or early ecological science. As the sun tilts toward mid-afternoon, the canals glimmer, and you can almost hear faint echoes of marketplaces yet to come. Cacao beans might be bartered for feathers, chili, or more exotic fruits. Maize might feed a festival, a ceremony, or simply a family dinner. you realize that every pod, every kernel, every strange berry tells a story of ingenuity, adaptation, and flavor. And in this sleepy hum of history, you drift past the floating gardens, tasting them with your mind's tongue, imagining the bite of sweet guava mingling with the bitter crunch of fresh maize. The Aztecs weren't just growing food, they were cultivating life itself, a blend of practicality, flavor, and, if fringe accounts are to be believed, tiny magical interventions meant to keep both humans and spirits satisfied. You smile at the thought, leaning against a soft reed as the sun flickers across the water, imagining the rich palette of tastes that fueled an empire, one floating garden at a time. You drift further along the winding canals, the gentle lapping of water against chinampas a lullaby, when suddenly you notice them. Curious fruits almost erased from memory. Tiny nopal berries cling stubbornly to cactus pads, their deep red skin gleaming like miniature rubies. Guava relatives dangle lazily, their aroma hinting at something both sweet and tart. Oddly shaped squashes twist and curl across the water's edge, like playful sculptures left behind by a mischievous gardener. You probably wouldn't survive tasting them all at once, though the thought makes you grin. Historians still argue whether these fruits were deliberately overlooked by post-conquest chroniclers, or if they simply fell out of favor over centuries. The nopal berries, for example, were both food and medicine, and some fringe accounts suggest they were used in minor rituals to ward off nightmares. Imagine a child in a chinampa at dusk, clutching a handful of these berries, while elders whisper stories of protection, their voices blending with the gentle hum of insects. You reach out and brush your fingers over a guava-like fruit, feeling the fuzz against your skin. Its scent is a soft perfume, sweet but earthy, and you imagine it sliced onto a small clay plate, served alongside maize cakes and cacao. Fringe tales whisper that certain guava relatives were believed to influence dreams. Historians remain skeptical, but it's a tantalizing thought. The idea that a fruit could nudge your imagination while you slept seems absurd, yet somehow, in this serene floating garden, it almost feels plausible. Moving along, you notice squashes that look more like art than sustenance, curled like question marks, ridged and ribbed, each one unique. The Aztecs experimented freely, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps to please the gods. Scholars still argue whether these oddities were bred purely for taste, for practical yield, or as offerings to spiritual forces. You can almost hear a farmer chuckling at a particularly knotted squash, thinking, "Well, you certainly have character." The water around the chinampas mirrors the sky in soft, rippled reflections, and you catch sight of tiny blossoms floating on the surface, fallen petals from nearby herbs and fruit trees. There's a sense of meticulous chaos here. Plants, water, insects, and sunlight coexisting in perfect balance. Fringe tales claim some chinampas contained miniature experimental gardens, where forbidden or forgotten fruits were tested for flavor or magical properties, though scholars debate how accurate these accounts are. You pause at a small patch where several obscure fruits grow side by side. Their vibrant colors contrast with the deep green of maize and the soft browns of rich soil floating above the water. The air carries a hint of sweetness, a whisper of earthiness, and if you close your eyes, you can almost taste the forgotten flavors, the tang of nopal berries, the mellow guava sweetness, the nutty undertone of young squashes. Somehow, in this gentle drifting, these fruits feel alive, keeping secrets of Aztec ingenuity and taste, waiting patiently for a curious wanderer like you to notice. You trudge through the interlaced fields of Chinampas as twilight begins to tiptoe across the canals, brushing the maize stalks with a soft golden glow. There's a rhythm to the planting here, subtle yet precise, as if the very land and water are breathing in time with the moon. Farmers aligned their sowing and harvesting with lunar cycles, believing that the phases could influence growth, flavor, and resilience. Historians still argue whether this timing was grounded more in ritualistic devotion or practical observation. But as you watch the gentle sway of crops under the silvered light, it feels almost like magic. Some fringe accounts whisper that moonlight wasn't just for guidance, but also for enchantment. Imagine tiny rituals performed in secret. A whisper here, a blessing there, hands lightly brushing over maize to coax it toward ripeness. You probably wouldn't survive trying it at home. You'd just end up with half your squash in the bathtub. But here, it makes sense. You step carefully along narrow, reed-lined paths, noting the interplay between water and earth, how canals reflected both sunlight and moonlight depending on the hour, creating an ever-changing palette that guided the farmer's eye. You notice small clusters of flowers tucked among the crops. Some are bright and practical, chilies or marigolds to repel pests, but others are subtle, chosen perhaps for aroma or symbolic meaning. Fringe sources suggest that certain blossoms were thought to carry protective properties, keeping misfortune at bay, though scholars remain skeptical. The moon would illuminate them, casting delicate shadows across the Chinampa surfaces, and for a moment, it's hard to separate the practical from the ceremonial. Listening closely, you hear the soft hum of insects, the whisper of water against wooden stakes, the occasional splash of a fish disturbed from its hiding spot. All of this is part of the rhythm, part of the unspoken choreography of survival and abundance. Some historians still argue whether the lunar alignment was more observational, tracking when plants sprouted best, or if it was an ingrained cultural practice that gave purpose to daily toil. As you wander, it feels like both, a dance of science and belief interwoven with the soft hiss of water and the scent of fresh soil. A gentle breeze carries the fragrance of flowering herbs mingled with the earthy aroma of ripening maize. You pause by a small plot where crescent-shaped squashes curl protectively around young shoots. Some fringe tales suggest that farmers whispered encouragement to their crops under the moonlight, convinced the plants could hear intentions. A practice almost too whimsical to imagine, yet somehow you picture it vividly. You lean back on a soft patch of mossy soil, watching shadows stretch and twist with the moon, realizing the Aztecs' connection to their fields was as much spiritual as it was practical. As night deepens, the patterns of Chinampas emerge clearly, linear yet fluid, structured yet playful, echoing the ebb and flow of water itself. You trudge slowly along, absorbing the soft symphony of life, the whisper of stalks, the gentle lapping against poles, the distant call of a nightbird. In this muted twilight, the moon guides not just the farmers, but also you, carrying you through rhythms of planting and ritual, science and belief. a quiet reminder that survival was always a blend of careful observation and deep, almost poetic intuition. You trudge along the canals, pausing to notice the tiniest actors in this floating drama. Insects. Bees flit from flower to flower with a purpose that seems almost arrogant in its efficiency, while tiny beetles scuttle over leaves and soil, performing invisible maintenance. You probably won't survive trying to mimic them, but their work keeps the Chinampas thriving. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs actively managed pollinators or simply benefited from their natural diligence. But as you watch, it seems intentional, almost choreographed. Some fringe accounts whisper that insects weren't merely helpers, they were considered protective spirits. A well-placed beetle or a carefully encouraged swarm of bees could supposedly guard a Chinampa from ill fortune or pestilence. You imagine a farmer kneeling in the soft mud at dusk, murmuring to a swarm of bees as if offering a gentle negotiation, and for a split second it seems plausible. The air buzzes with energy, a faint hum that lulls your senses while keeping the gardens alive in ways you never considered. You notice that certain flowers, tucked in between maize and squash, seem strategically planted to attract these little guardians. Marigolds, with their bright golden petals, beckon pollinators while subtly deterring pests. Fringe tales claim some blossoms were chosen not for their aroma or color, but for conversations with insects, tiny messages encoded in pollen patterns or nectar sweetness, though scholars debate whether this was symbolic or coincidental. You reach down to brush a marigold, inhaling the slightly bitter scent, imagining the bees carrying whispers from flower to flower. As you float gently along the canals, you catch glimpses of dragonflies skimming the water, their iridescent wings slicing sunlight into fractured rainbows. Their presence seems almost ceremonial, a subtle reminder that life here isn't just about human ingenuity, but also an intricate network of symbiosis. You notice tiny holes in leaves, evidence of caterpillars munching away, and realize that even pests play a role in this delicate balance. Fringe narratives hint that certain insects were celebrated in festivals, their brief lives honored as contributions to the garden's magic, though historians remain skeptical. You pause to watch a bee settle on a squash blossom, wings vibrating delicately, pollen clinging to its legs. It's mesmerizing. Every movement seems purposeful, a reminder that the Aztecs' survival relied not just on soil, water, and sunlight, but on an entire ecosystem cooperating silently beneath the surface. The soft hum of pollinators blends with the lapping water, creating a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm. You lean back, letting the sensory symphony wash over you, realizing that even the smallest creatures were part of a grand strategy. Without them, those floating gardens wouldn't just falter. They might vanish entirely. And somehow, that delicate dance of life, water, and labor feels like a secret that's been patiently waiting for a curious wanderer like you to notice. You trudge further along the Chinampas, and suddenly the air thickens with scent, a complex perfume of chilies, annatto, and fragrant herbs that seem to announce themselves with pride. This is the spice and herb labyrinth, where flavor was as much a part of Aztec culture as sustenance. You probably wouldn't survive sampling every aroma at once without a few sneezes, but drifting through them, you can imagine the culinary creativity that thrived here. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs used some herbs primarily for taste, medicine, or ritual purposes. You pause at a small cluster of chili plants, their red and green peppers dangling like tiny torches. Fringe accounts suggest that certain chilies were cultivated not just for cooking, but also to enhance spiritual clarity, or even induce mild visions during ceremonies. You can almost picture an Aztec chef carefully grinding them alongside cacao and flowers, producing flavors both bold and mysterious. The smell alone carries a promise of mischief and delight. Like the gardens themselves are nudging you toward curiosity. Nearby, anato plants stretch tall, their seeds bright orange, almost glowing in the afternoon sun. Used for coloring food and textiles, anato also played a subtle role in the aesthetic of a meal. Fringe stories claim that experimental gardeners sometimes mixed anato with other plant extracts to create edible artworks meant to dazzle the eyes as well as the tongue, though scholars debate how widespread such practices truly were. You run your fingers over the smooth leaves, imagining pigments staining fingertips like nature's watercolor palette. Herbs grow interspersed among the staple crops: marjoram, epazote, and tiny flowering plants, whose leaves seem designed to burst with flavor when lightly crushed. Some were thought to ward off pests, others to improve digestion, and a few may have even been used in secretive flavor experiments. Historians still argue whether certain combinations were accidental discoveries or the result of intentional culinary trial and error. You chuckle at the idea of ancient Aztec taste labs, where farmers doubled as experimental chefs, their noses and tongues guiding the evolution of flavor. As you float along, the fragrance mingles with the watery hum of the canals, a delicate reminder that every element of the chinampa is purposeful. You notice tiny blossoms drifting in the breeze, petals landing softly on maize leaves, while insects flit between plants, aiding pollination and occasionally carrying whispers of old legends. Fringe accounts suggest that some herbs were used to enhance the sweetness of fruits, or even prolong freshness, a kind of ancient botanical alchemy, though scholars remain skeptical. You inhale deeply, letting the subtle aromas settle, imagining the Aztec hands that tended these plants with care, blending practicality, beauty, and perhaps a touch of secret mischief. The labyrinth of herbs and spices stretches ahead, a living mosaic of color and scent. Each plant feels like a small story, a subtle hint of culture, taste, and perhaps even magic, waiting for those patient enough to notice. And as you drift past, you realize the Aztecs didn't just grow food. They curated experiences, teaching future generations that nourishment can be sensory, spiritual, and delightfully unpredictable all at once. You trudge along the chinampas, feeling the subtle rise and fall beneath your feet as the canals shift with each gentle ripple. Water here isn't just a backdrop, it's part of the architecture, a living scaffold for crops. The Aztecs engineered an intricate network of canals, aqueducts, and sluices to keep these floating gardens viable year-round. You probably wouldn't survive trying to replicate this at home unless your bathtub doubles as a hydro-engineering lab. but the precision is impressive. Historians still debate the extent of their hydraulic mastery versus what was achieved through careful trial and error. You pause to watch the water lapping against the wooden stakes that hold each chinampa in place. Fringe tales whisper that some canals were designed to carry subtle messages. A soft whisper to passing neighbors or distant markets, though scholars remain skeptical. You notice the way light dances on the water's surface, reflecting rows of maize, squashes, and herbs, creating a pattern that feels both deliberate and organic. Every ripple seems to echo the rhythm of centuries-old ingenuity, as if the water itself remembers the hands that shaped it. Along the banks, small channels guide excess water away from crops, preventing rot and keeping roots oxygenated. You lean over and catch a faint scent of rich mud mixed with herbs, a smell that seems alive, almost magnetic. Fringe sources claim that some chinampas were lined with special stones to influence growth, absorbing sunlight or even moonlight to nudge seeds toward vitality. Historians still argue whether these were practical measures or ritualistic embellishments. But watching the calm precision of the canals, it's easy to imagine both possibilities existing simultaneously. You notice tiny fish darting through shallow water, their silvery bodies reflecting sunlight in flashes. They help control pests, adding a subtle layer to the ecosystem. Insects buzz lazily above the water, some pollinating plants, others perhaps carrying whispered messages from one end of the chinampa network to another. Fringe accounts suggest that certain fish species were selectively introduced to carry small symbolic meanings during ceremonies, a notion historians debate, but you can't help imagining. The gentle clatter of a wooden paddle against a canoe drifts across the water, accompanied by the soft slap of a fish's tail. You step carefully along the narrow paths, balancing between vegetation and canal, feeling the delicate tension that makes the chinampas work. Each inch is a combination of human ingenuity and natural cooperation, a ballet of soil, water, plants, and creatures. You breathe in deeply, sensing the subtle blend of practicality and experimentation, the engineers of flavor and survival. The canals shimmer like liquid mirrors, reflecting the sky and the ingenuity of a civilization that literally built life on water, proving that necessity, curiosity, and maybe a dash of clever audacity can create something both functional and beautiful. You trudge along the canals. The golden light of late afternoon painting ripples across the water, when you realize something subtle but powerful. These floating gardens weren't just about survival. They were about tribute. Exotic fruits and crops were collected, offered, and gifted, a quiet currency of power and influence. Historians still argue whether tribute was primarily economic, political, or a blend of both. But walking among the chinampas, it feels like a careful choreography of obligation and generosity. Some fringe accounts whisper that every rare fruit could carry secrets, tiny packets of knowledge from distant regions, traded by spies and merchants. Imagine a merchant paddling quietly under the moonlight, delivering noble berries or rare squashes, not just as food, but as coded messages of diplomacy. You probably wouldn't survive trying to smuggle a few yourself without raising suspicion, but the idea adds a tinge of intrigue to the gentle swaying of the gardens. You pause at a section overflowing with guava relatives and other forgotten fruits, their vibrant colors a feast for the eyes and nose. Some fruits were considered prestigious gifts, presented to nobles, visiting dignitaries, or even neighboring cities. Fringe tales suggest that particular combinations of flavors were chosen to send subtle messages, sweetness implying goodwill, bitterness a subtle warning, though scholars debate how seriously these symbolic meanings were taken. The canals reflect the light in liquid ribbons, shimmering beneath hanging pods and curling squash, turning each garden into a floating stage for politics and taste. Insects hum lazily above the blossoms, unbothered by the weight of human concern, while small fish flicker beneath the water, unnoticed yet vital. The Aztecs understood this interplay. Tribute required thriving gardens. Thriving gardens required careful ecosystem management. Some historians argue that without understanding the balance between labor, water management, and pollination, tribute crops would have failed spectacularly. Fringe accounts suggest secret test gardens existed, where nobles would experiment with rare plants before sending them as offerings, as if the fruit itself were auditioning for status. You float along, imagining the delicate negotiations and ceremonial exchanges, the soft clinking of cacao beans used as currency, the careful selection of maize and exotic fruits. Each chinampa feels alive with history, its crops carrying stories of trade, diplomacy, and quiet ambition. The vibrant berries and squashes are more than nourishment. They are symbols, reminders that even in a garden, politics can bloom alongside flavor. And as the soft hum of water and insects lulls your senses, you realize that these floating gardens weren't just practical. They were living theaters, where every fruit, leaf, and stalk could play a role in the grand drama of Aztec life. You trudge along the chinampas, tasting the subtle layers of flavor in your imagination. Sweet, sour, bitter, and sometimes a surprising hint of something almost smoky. The Aztecs believed that taste and medicine often overlapped. A bite of nopal berry could soothe a cough. A sip of cacao could invigorate the body. Historians still argue whether medicinal claims were based on empirical observation, spiritual belief, or a blend of both. But walking here, it's easy to see why they thought flavor carried power. Fringe accounts suggest that some fruits were even aphrodisiacs, whispered about in secret corners of the marketplace. You probably wouldn't survive sampling them all at once without an overdose of curiosity or giggles. But the stories add a playful, mischievous note to the gardens. You imagine a young noble cautiously nibbling a bright red berry, while an older cousin smirks knowingly nearby. It's a gentle reminder that food, in these floating gardens, was never just food. It was intertwined with social rituals, small adventures, and subtle lessons. You pause beside a patch of guava relatives, inhaling the soft aroma and imagining the tang of flesh against your tongue. Fringe tales hint that certain fruits could enhance dreams or influence moods, though scholars remain skeptical. You watch the sun slide lower, casting golden streaks across the canals, reflecting the twisted shapes of squashes and the vibrant reds and oranges of distant berries. Each bite, each scent, feels deliberate, carefully cultivated to please not only the stomach, but also the imagination. Insects flit among blossoms, hummingbirds dart and hover, and tiny fish flicker beneath the surface, all part of a living choreography. The Aztecs noticed these interactions, likely seeing patterns that allowed them to predict when fruits would ripen or which combinations of crops thrived best together. Fringe sources suggest that some of the forgotten fruits were intentionally paired with certain herbs to enhance flavor, prolong freshness, or even convey subtle symbolic meanings. Historians still debate the line between practical wisdom and ritual interpretation, but you can feel both possibilities swirling in the humid air. You lean against a gently swaying maize stalk, imagining a ceremonial table laid out with these flavors: sweet, bitter, sour, bright, dark. Each fruit tells a story, some of survival, others of creativity, diplomacy, and quiet indulgence. You probably won't survive trying to catalog every taste, yet you can savor the rhythm of it, the gentle lapping of water, the hum of life, the lingering scents mixing with fading sunlight. Sweet, sour, bitter. These aren't just flavors, they are lessons, experiences, and echoes of an empire that understood that even the simplest fruit could carry meaning, magic, and memory. You trudge along the soft, narrow pathways of the Chinampas, clutching a small bundle of seeds you've gathered from the day's exploration. Each kernel, each tiny fruit pit, carries the promise of new life, a whisper from the past. Some seeds have been lost over time, vanished with conquest and colonial disruption, while others survived, hidden in quiet corners or cultivated secretly by devoted families. Historians still argue whether European contact or internal changes caused the greatest loss of Aztec horticultural diversity. But standing here, among thriving Chinampas, it feels miraculous that any have endured at all. Fringe accounts suggest that certain seeds held more than potential. They were believed to carry ancestral energy, tiny vessels of wisdom and luck. You probably wouldn't survive testing each one for magic at home without spilling half into a puddle. But the idea lingers like a soft, mischievous hum. A nopal berry seed might be sown with a whispered prayer, a tiny squash kernel tucked under a leaf with an incantation for abundance. The Aztecs understood that survival wasn't just about food. It was about maintaining continuity, safeguarding the future in each grain, each kernel. You step carefully along a water-slick path, noticing how the plants arch toward the sun, how the maize stalks lean into the breeze. Some seeds are tucked into the corners of Chinampas, growing quietly, almost invisibly, like treasures hidden in plain sight. Fringe sources hint that certain seeds were exchanged in secret networks, small-scale botanical espionage of sorts, though scholars debate how widespread these practices really were. The idea makes you grin. A hidden economy of seeds floating atop water, whispering ancient secrets, The soft scent of damp earth and ripening crops fills your senses, mingling with the fragrance of herbs and flowers that pepper the chinampas. You pause to watch a small plot where multiple varieties of maize intertwine with beans and squashes, a living testament to the Aztecs' ecological intuition. Each seed carries a story of careful observation, experimentation, and adaptation. Fringe tales even suggest that some seeds were selectively preserved to ensure the survival of rare flavors or colors, tiny gems of horticultural foresight. Historians still argue whether such practices were strategic or ceremonial, but the evidence of diversity before your eyes is undeniable. As twilight deepens, the canals shimmer, reflecting the dimming light, and you imagine the future generations who might tread these paths. Each seed you hold is a thread connecting past and present, a tangible fragment of ingenuity and resilience. You breathe in slowly, feeling the soft sway of chinampas beneath your feet, the gentle whisper of water, the faint hum of insects. All the small forces that nurtured these seeds and carried them through history. In this quiet moment, you sense the profound truth: survival wasn't just about growing food. It was about cultivating stories, memory, and possibility, one small seed at a time. You trudge into what feels like the heart of the Chinampa network, where the vibrant colors of fruits, herbs, and flowers create a sensory playground. The marketplaces of imagination open in your mind, buzzing with the potential combinations of flavors. You probably wouldn't survive sampling every experimental dish the Aztecs might have imagined, but drifting here, you can almost taste it. Sweet maize mingling with bitter cacao, spiced guava paired with tangy squash, a subtle hint of marigold for aroma. Historians still argue whether culinary creativity was encouraged primarily for pleasure, for ritual, or as a display of status. But you can sense all three dancing together in the gentle evening light. Fringe accounts whisper that playful competition sometimes took place where chefs tested their creativity, daring one another to invent new flavor pairings. You can almost hear the laughter of apprentices, the quiet nods of elders, and perhaps a whispered, "Don't overdo the chili, or you'll offend the gods." A gentle cautionary tale hiding within a culinary challenge. It's not far-fetched to imagine that such playful experimentation shaped the subtle, complex palate of the empire, teaching both flavor and diplomacy in one bite. You pause beside a small chinampa overflowing with guava relatives and unusual squashes, imagining tiny tasting plates set out on leaves or woven mats. Fringe stories hint that some fruits were paired to produce surprising effects, not hallucinogenic, but enough to startle the tongue and intrigue the mind. Scholars remain skeptical about the scope of these flavor games. But as the sun tilts toward twilight, you notice the careful arrangement of crops, the interplay of shapes and colors, almost as if the gardens themselves were performing a gentle symphony for the senses. Bees and hummingbirds flit among blossoms, while small fish glide beneath the canal's surface, unnoticed but essential. The interplay of sensory delight and natural rhythm mirrors the Aztecs' approach to food, practical, artistic, and deeply integrated into the environment. Fringe sources even suggest that certain fruit combinations were used as playful messages between households, subtle notes of flirtation or camaraderie hidden within the bite of a sweet berry or a spicy squash. Historians still debate whether these anecdotes reflect real practices or later imaginative storytelling. But imagining them makes the gardens feel alive, interactive, and mischievous. You drift past a small gathering of brightly colored chilies and herbs, inhaling the mingling fragrances. Each plant seems ready to contribute to a culinary experiment, a floating atelier where taste, sight, and aroma converge. The soft hum of insects, the gentle slap of water against the chinampa edges, the muted rustle of leaves, all merge into a serene symphony. You smile at the thought of playful chefs testing limits, tasting, adjusting, learning, and laughing. And as the water glimmers like liquid gold under the late afternoon sun, you sense that these gardens were more than food. They were creative playgrounds, lessons in life, and small theaters for culinary delight. You trudge along the soft, meandering paths between chinampas, noticing the subtle whispers of legend carried on the breeze. Certain fruits, herbs, and flowers weren't merely edible. They had stories, myths, and meanings embedded in their leaves, petals, and seeds. Scholars still debate the precise significance, but some glyphs suggest that fruits like guava relatives, nopal berries, and twisted squashes carried symbolic weight, representing fertility, prosperity, or even divine favor. You probably wouldn't survive decoding all of it at once without your brain spinning like a maize husk in the wind. But the faint hints are everywhere, waiting for a patient observer. Fringe accounts suggest that some fruits were thought to harbor spirits, tiny custodians of the chinampas, watching over crops and guiding harvests. You lean over a cluster of red nopal berries and imagine a soft hum of invisible guardians, a gentle reassurance for farmers as they toil. The air carries the mingling scents of sweet fruit and earthy soil, and it feels like the past is breathing softly around you, offering tiny narratives with every glance, every scent. You pause at a small plot where squashes curl protectively around young shoots. Glyphs hint at protective or playful qualities, though historians still argue whether these interpretations reflect actual belief or modern projection. Fringe sources even claim that certain fruit pairings were used to teach lessons, virtues, cautionary tales, or stories about gods and mortals, hidden within the rhythm of daily life. Imagine a child picking a squash and being subtly reminded of a story about patience, resourcefulness, or generosity. It's an education wrapped in flavor, texture, and color. The canals shimmer in the fading sunlight, reflecting the vibrant mosaic of chinampas. Bees flit lazily among flowers, insects hum their quiet symphony, and tiny fish dart beneath the surface, each playing its role in the theater of life. Some fringe tales suggest that rituals around these fruits were conducted at night, under lantern light, with soft chants to ensure good growth. Scholars debate the accuracy, but you can almost hear the whispers, feel the energy, and imagine the quiet ceremonies performed in shadowed corners of floating gardens. As you float along, You notice how each plant, each fruit, carries not only taste and nutrition, but a narrative, a memory, a cultural imprint. The Aztecs didn't just grow food. They cultivated stories, language, and meaning in every chinampa. And as the water reflects the early evening sky, you realize that the legacy of these forgotten fruits is more than flavor. It is myth, it is lore, and it is an enduring whisper of an empire that understood the poetry of growth, harvest, and imagination. You trudge into the final stretch of the Chinampas, the twilight now deepening into a calm, indigo evening. Shadows stretch across the water, elongating the silhouettes of maize, squashes, and mysterious fruits that seem to shimmer in the fading light. You probably won't survive trying to catalog every forgotten fruit here. Each one carries centuries of cultivation, experimentation, and subtle cultural signals, but the richness is intoxicating. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs intended to preserve these varieties for ritual, survival, or sheer curiosity, but the evidence lies beneath your fingertips and in the gentle sway of every floating plot. Fringe accounts whisper that some fruits held hidden codes, messages for those who knew how to interpret their shapes, colors, or growth patterns. You imagine a young apprentice tracing the curve of a squash like a map, discovering secret lessons tucked in plain sight. The air hums with life, the soft slap of water against wooden stakes, bees settling among blossoms, fish flicking beneath the surface, and you realize that every sound and scent contributes to a sensory archive, a living memory of ingenuity. You pause at a particularly lush chinampa where guava relatives, nopal berries, and oddly shaped squashes intertwine. The combination seems almost intentional, an experiment in flavors, colors, and perhaps even symbolism. Fringe sources suggest that some fruits were designed to evoke joy, caution, or wonder, subtly guiding human behavior while feeding the body. Scholars still debate whether these interpretations are credible or the product of modern romanticism, but the gentle sway of leaves and ripples of water make it easy to believe. The canals reflect a sky streaked with the last hints of pink and orange, merging with the deep green of the floating gardens. You imagine festival tables laden with these forgotten fruits, their flavors and fragrances offering lessons in taste, ritual, and community. The Aztecs understood that nourishment was more than sustenance. It was culture, diplomacy, play, and sometimes magic, all grown on water and curated with patient hands. As the soft night settles, you realize the Chinampas are more than gardens. They are archives of taste, memory, and myth. Each fruit, each kernel, each curl of a squash tells a story that survived conquest, time, and forgetfulness. And as you drift slowly along the canals, guided by moonlight and the gentle hum of water, it becomes clear that these forgotten fruits are not lost. They are waiting for dreamers like you to remember, taste, and imagine them once more. Now the day's work in the Chinampas recedes into a gentle hum, the twilight softening into night. You trudge slowly along the water, feeling the cool sway beneath your feet, the subtle rhythm of life lapping against your senses. Every maize stalk, every curl of squash, Every forgotten berry seems to exhale softly, inviting you to breathe, to release, to settle into the calm. The aromas of herbs and fruits linger faintly, a gentle reminder of flavors imagined and remembered, while the air carries the soft whispers of insects and fish that continue their quiet work unseen. You feel the weight of centuries lift, replaced by a soothing hum of continuity. The Aztecs, their hands and minds, and the floating gardens they nurtured all dissolve into a sense of peaceful rhythm. The water mirrors the soft light of the moon now, scattering silver across gentle ripples. Tiny waves carry faint scents, whispers of forgotten fruits, and lessons in patience and care. Fringe tales of magical berries and secret rituals float by like soft, distant echoes, and you allow yourself a smile, knowing some mysteries are best left lingering in imagination. The world quiets. Your mind softens. You feel a slow drift of serenity as the canals, the gardens, and the forgotten fruits all hum a lullaby of human ingenuity and natural wonder. Each memory of taste, each imagined aroma, each gentle sway of water is absorbed softly, filling your senses with calm. The Aztecs' floating gardens, once a theater of life, labor, and creativity, now cradle your mind in their gentle, watery embrace. As you settle fully into the gentle night, you realize these gardens, these fruits, these echoes of an empire are not gone. They are here with you, a quiet, enduring rhythm. Softly, slowly, your thoughts drift. The water hums. The night breathes, and you finally ease into sleep, carried gently by history itself.